unfortunately, over the past 12 months has been very much in the news. What we've seen is terrorist attacks here on the mainland of Europe that have exposed, I guess, weaknesses in a number of issues, the sharing of intelligence and information within nations and between nations. And this panel, I think, is really very well placed to discuss what went wrong to some degree, but what should be done to address these issues. So I'd like to introduce, first of all, then Michael Chertoff, who was in Washington on 9/11 and in many ways led the US response to that from the Justice Department and in drafting the Homeland Security Bill. Sir David Omand, who's a former director of GCHQ in the UK, the British Signals Intelligence Agency. Annemie Turtelboom, who's a member of the Federal Parliament of Belgium and is a former Justice Minister of the Federal Government of Belgium. And August Hanning, who's a former president of the German Federal Intelligence Agency. We're just going to look now at what the issues are. I want to remind you that you can, apart from if you're in the audience, you can obviously put your hand up and ask questions when we get there. You can send questions via the TATRA Summit app, or you can tweet using the hashtag GTS16. Michael, would you introduce the issues for us?
Sure.
Go to the lectern over there.
Okay, great. That music was terrific. It really wakes you up on a Sunday morning. Welcome, everybody. I hope you've had an opportunity to read the report. It's a red-cover document which is out in the anteroom. And as the video indicates, our purpose in looking at this issue was to try to evaluate what were the lessons learned from the attacks that occurred in 2015 and 2016, and what are the kinds of practical recommendations we can make about how to improve intelligence sharing and intelligence capabilities. If you look at the attacks that occurred in Paris and in Belgium and in other parts of Europe over the last year or 2 years, one of the striking things is the degree to which some of the attackers and terrorists were actually known to police authorities or to intelligence authorities in one country, but somehow that information did not get turned into operational activity that would have stopped an attack. And this is a problem, of course, we face in the United States after September 11th. We, as a single country, didn't have quite the same legal set of issues that you have when you have 27 or 30 countries cooperating. But we also had to think about how do we bring together intelligence and how do we share it. I think one of the challenges we face now in particular is, as we've moved beyond the large-scale, top-down attack that we saw, for example, on September 11th, and we now have more low-level attacks, small groups like we saw in Paris, or even individuals acting because they're inspired or directed, it becomes harder and harder to use the traditional intelligence tools to identify where the threat is. More and more of the information about potential terrorists will come from communities, local police, or local community officials. And we need to find a way to build that into the intelligence apparatus. Likewise, the intelligence apparatus needs to educate and train local police and local officials about what to look for, so that we can attune them to what they need to be mindful of. In putting out the report that we issued, which is, as the video says, is just the first step, there were two principal objectives we had in mind. One was to see if there's a way to raise capabilities in intelligence collection and analytics across the board with all countries in Europe and on a transatlantic basis, recognizing some countries have quite well developed collection and analytic tools, and some countries are frankly less well developed. And so some of our recommendations are focused on capacity building, a center of excellence, training, standardization of language and approach. And the second challenge, besides capability, is trust. We recognize that every agency, quite understandably, wants to protect its information. You want to make sure that your sources and methods of information aren't compromised and that nobody gets killed. If you're engaged in planning a law enforcement operation or a similar security operation, you don't want to have that leak out and warn the targets before you actually can apprehend them. So how do you share information with not only multiple agencies in a single country, but with multiple agencies in multiple countries? How do you share when the sharing itself creates a vulnerability about leakage? And so, again, some of our proposals have to do with building trust, recognizing that some countries are sufficiently familiar with each other and have a sufficient track record of working together that you can pull them into a single hub and have them genuinely share information almost like a single organization. Other countries aren't quite there yet, but you can do ad hoc sharing or case-based sharing on an individual basis. So these are the kinds of practical solutions we're trying to put out there. I would leave you with this thought before we begin the discussion. One thing we did not want to do was to build a new bureaucracy. So our recommendation is acknowledge the work that is being done as we speak, both in European institutions and at the national level, and seeks to build on that work rather than to start with a brand new superstructure. Finally, let me extend my thanks to the steering committee, which was identified in the video, a broad group of advisors, many of whom have joined us today for this presentation. We had advice from senior former intelligence and current intelligence officials from 14 different countries. We dealt with NATO officials, with EU officials, and they were all very cooperative. And we had a terrific staff led by Daniela Richterova and Patrick Berry, which helped pull all this together into the report. So this is stage one. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think in some ways this discussion is about Europe. We'll look at the US in some ways as an example of what happened after 9/11 and the silos into which information intelligence and FBI and other investigations were drawn. I mean, and I think in the report you say there's still some issues in the US. So before we use the US as an example that Europe might follow, what do you see as the sort of outstanding issues that still need to be resolved in terms of the US counterterrorism issue?
Well, if you look at the attacks we've had in the last few years in the US, we've had, not very many, but we've had some. We had San Bernardino, we had Orlando, where someone went into a nightclub and killed a number of people. We had Major Nidal Hassan, who was an Army officer who actually went in Fort Hood and killed over a dozen people. In each of these cases, we were dealing not with very elaborate plots with a lot of people, but with plots where you had a couple of individuals, or even an individual acting more or less alone, perhaps in contact over the internet with others or being inspired by others, but not part of an elaborate plot. And I think that what we discovered in our own country is, notwithstanding all the work done to build fusion centers and integration centers, In the end, you still need to have people who understand what to look for. And if you went back, for example, to the Orlando shooter, you discovered that for months before he carried out his attack, there were complaints about him at the workplace because he was acting out in erratic ways. He seemed to be unbalanced, and no action was taken. Time and again, the problem is somebody raises their hand and says, there's a problem, and either nobody follows up, or the people who follow up don't really understand what to do, or the information gets lost. So, now I understand human error is a feature of life. Part of what I think we are trying to do now in the US is to make sure that people understand that they ought to, when they have a suspicion about violent behavior or destructive behavior, they ought to know who to go to, and it ought to be followed up in an effective manner. And that doesn't just mean, routinely checking the box and asking a few questions, but it means having a deeper understanding of what we need to be looking for. And one thing I will say honestly is social media. Many of these individuals actually advertise their inclinations before they carry out attacks. And I think we sometimes neglect that as a warning sign. So we're also working on making sure we can be attuned to this.
Thank you. I'd like to ask each of the other panelists, first of all, what big lesson you drew from the last year in Europe, the attacks in Paris and in Brussels. What do you think is the main lesson that should be learned in terms of counterintelligence, counterterrorism? David?
I think the lesson is actually an old one. It's that you have to harness the capabilities of the state and the population. You have to information freely volunteered from the populations concerned. You have to have the ability to acquire secret intelligence on the locations, the identities, the intentions of those who mean us harm. We've always known that. The United Kingdom, sadly, we had a 30-year campaign in Northern Ireland that spread to the United Kingdom. And it forced us to break down those barriers between internal services and external services, between law enforcement and intelligence, between what you can do with open sources and has to come from secret sources, and the importance of having the population on side. And we learned a lot of very hard lessons and made a lot of mistakes. But as a result, in the last 18 months, in the United Kingdom, 7, or perhaps it's now 8 plots of Salafist, jihadist, terrorist plots have been stopped. Now that doesn't mean you can guarantee, and I think it's important that it comes in this report, this is about risk management. You can never give a guarantee that the bad guys will not get through, but you can reduce the threat to the population very substantially. And I think we know how to do it, and a lot of it's in this report.
Annemie, I see you were in Brussels. I assume I was in Brussels in March. What lessons do you draw from what did you learn then, and what needs to be done in the Belgian context and more broadly?
Well, we had, of course, the attack at the airport, but we had an attack on the Jewish Museum 2 years ago. It was, in fact, the first time. It was the evening before the elections, and due to that, it was a bit like it was due to the fact that it was a Jewish museum. It was not given that importance in the public opinion that normally it had to be, because it was, for me, I was then the Minister of Justice. It was for me the first time that I knew that it was the first attack in Brussels, but not the last attack. And for me, the most important thing is more cooperation between European countries. I see at this moment that Eurojust is working much more together between European countries, but on a bilateral basis. But I think that's not enough. Because we can't deal with that kind of threats only on a national basis. We need more cooperation between European countries. And that's, we have at this moment in Europe, we have one big issue and one big problem. That's the Treaty of Lisbon. In that Treaty of Lisbon is explicitly written down that security is the competence of the national member states. And I'm convinced that in the long term, we must think about how we can write another, or how we can adapt the Treaty of Lisbon, that we must give also some competences to a higher level. I know that it's a terrible discussion between 28 member states, and then after that we need also, like in the report is written down, a transnational cooperation between the United States and Europe, because everything that's concerning cybercriminality and digitalization is, then Europe is not the level, then we must work together also with other continents. But what I'm saying is very, very hard on the European level, because everyone wants to share information, and you've said it very well, it's the most important problem is trust. They don't trust each other.
We'll come back, I think, to some of those issues, but if we're waiting for a change in the Lisbon Treaty, we might be waiting quite a long time.
Yes.
August, the lessons you drew from last year.
Yes, I think it has shown some weaknesses in our European, our national systems. You can only share information if you have gained this information before. And I saw some weaknesses. I saw this in Belgium, but I saw this in Germany as well. A lot of people have entered Germany during the so-called refugee crisis without a proper identification, for example. And therefore, it's sometimes very difficult if we get information from outside. This person is dangerous, that person may be dangerous, but to identify this person is still very difficult. I think we need a better databases. We need more information about the people who are entering the EU. We have to improve our border control. I think we need a European PNR. And again, we have to look to our national weaknesses. And we have some weaknesses in Germany as well. We have legal problems in sharing information. Our constitutional court has sometimes made painful restrictions for the law enforcement agencies and for the intelligence agencies. And the other point really is that we have, for example, a big problem to cover the communication between places like Mosul and Raqqa and Germany. We can only follow individual communication, but of course it would be really necessary to cover the whole information, the whole communication between such crucial places like Mosul and Raqqa. And therefore it's then helpful to have the United States. We are blaming the United States. We are all victims of Mr. Snowden, and trust has been mentioned. And we have investigation committees in the German parliament. But on the other side, we are heavily dependent from the United States because they are providing the necessary information for preparing terrorist attacks in Germany. And we have been successful several times, like David said, for Great Britain. I think the same in Germany. We have this lone wolf syndrome. It's a problem, this kind of radicalization. And we see new procedures. We see procedures like in Brussels and Paris, but now we see individuals in Germany closely linked to ISIS, and they are carrying out their terrorist attacks. We have seen this in Würzburg, we have seen this now in Chemnitz, and that is a constant danger, and that's a huge challenge for our law enforcement and intelligence agencies.
But as August has just said, the truth is that in many parts of Europe, fears for privacy have taken priority over the need to acquire intelligence on those who mean us harm. I personally do not believe in trading off privacy and security. We need both. And I believe it is possible in a mature democracy to have legislation, to have oversight of the role of judges, all of those things, to make sure that these powerful intelligence tools are never misused. And I don't need to emphasize that in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, that they must not be misused. But if you don't have bulk access to the global communications networks, you will not be able to, as August has said, you will not be able to detect the communications from Syria, from Iraq, track down those who are heading for Europe. And the cooperation across the Atlantic in that respect, I think, is essential.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we're about to hit a period, I think, where this problem is going to intensify because, hopefully the campaign in Mosul will be successful. Daesh or ISIS will be driven out of Mosul. We hope to see other progress being made on the ground in Iraq and even in Syria. But the people who are working with ISIS or Daesh are not going to disappear. They're going to go someplace else. Some of them will go to other parts of the Middle East or North Africa, for example, Libya. But some will come back to Europe. And so we're going to see more and more foreign fighters returning, and they will be trained, and they will be battle-hardened, and some of them at least will want to carry out operations here in Europe or in the United States. And that means finding these individuals and being able to monitor them becomes very, very important. And I think there's some practical things that we can do in order to achieve that. First, I'm pleased that the Europeans have now adopted a passenger name record system. That's a very important way of tracking who might be coming into the continent, flying in or using other public transportation, so that if there's somebody who you can connect up to ISIS or Daesh by looking at, for example, who paid for the ticket or where they have been before, that gives you an ability then to focus on that person and monitor them. The second challenge is going to be to continue that monitoring. I think if you read the report, one of the sad things that emerges is some of the terrorists who carried out attacks were known to the authorities, but they lost track of these people. And so we need to look at technology, as David said, that enables us sometimes to monitor people's online behavior or communications as a way of tracking them once you've identified them as a potential threat. So there are technological tools out there that can actually help avoid the problem we had with having people drop off the radar screen. But we have to be willing to use those tools.
Somebody in the Belgian debate described this problem of too much information and too little analysis as infobesity. That's quite a good phrase, I thought. I'd just like to, August, ask you about what David said earlier, which was related to the privacy issue. And do you sense that the German debate had changed? I mean, in the initial aftermath of the Snowden disclosures, there was a sort of very strong resistance. And then, of course, we've seen these attacks. Do you think the German public opinion and German political opinion has changed with respect to big data and surveillance?
Yes, of course, it has changed to a certain extent. It has to do, of course, with this refugee crisis. Now the German public is aware that it is a very risky way of dealing with this crisis to allow a lot of people, more than 1 million people, without proper identification to enter our country. I think it's a huge risk for our internal security. And the other point, of course, we have seen these attempts for carrying out terrorist attacks inside Germany. And they have been successful, yes, avoided due to the operation and due to the information from we call it publicly, from other intelligence services, but in fact it's the NSA. And more and more people in Germany are aware about this problem, and that is really necessary to cover communication. Communication is the weak point for the terrorists from the other side, because they have their links to ISIS in the Middle East, and they need to communicate, and therefore I think that's very important to cover this kind of communication. And again, there's more and more public awareness in Germany that that is a really necessary exercise, and that we have to improve our own capacities, but we have to improve our cooperation with other intelligence services as well.
I think it's time for the audience, if you have questions, to start to prepare them. We've got a couple of questions through the app, which are on the screen. The first one: what will life after ISIS look like? There's Al Qaeda, now ISIS. What will be next? And the other one, which is interesting, in the age of mass data collection and all high tech, what's the role of future of the traditional cloak and dagger human intelligence in today's intelligence gathering? I'd like to address that to enemy because without sort of beating up on the Belgians, I mean, partly there is obviously an international issue, but the Belgian intelligence service has been severely under-resourced. I think the line item in the budget is 50 million euros. If you're surveilling like one person 24 hours a day, that's probably going to take you 15 people to do that. If they average, say, 50,000 euros a year, that's basically 1.5% of the Belgian intelligence budget to follow one person. I mean, what's your reaction to that? I mean, is it, you know, in Belgium, for example, it's not just a matter of poor liaison, but also of resources, no?
But it's in every country, it's a question also of money. You can share a lot of information, you can give all the information to everyone, but when you don't have the office really to analyze the information and see what you can do with it, then you can have the situation that you have all the information and it's somewhere, but you can't do anything with it. And it's exactly the same also on the European level. I'm very happy that we have at Europol at this moment 45 people working in a counterterrorism cell. But when I'm looking to New York, you have several hundreds, and the population is 10 million, and in Europe the population is 500 million. So in fact, there's a gap. Yes, we must share information, and the more we can share information about potential criminals, the more we can protect the privacy of the 99.9% of the population who's not having stupid IDs and who's doing well. That's for me very important that you can, that's the way to protect and the privacy and sharing the information. But then you also need money. When I compare the money that Europol and Eurojust have, the budget that they have at this moment, it's not enough. It's not enough. When I see that we start with the European prosecutor, but that he can only occupy himself with fraud or financial fraud that can hurt the European ID, then I think that it's not enough. I could say it's a nice start, but it's not enough.
Thank you, David.
Published figures show the United Kingdom, we employ 5,500 people collecting and analyzing digital intelligence alone. That's the kind of scale of effort that is needed. The United States effort is many times that, of course, but for a European country, I think that's a reason. Despite the fact we've had austerity in the UK as a public policy ever since the great crash of 2008. So I think there is a question about investment. I should say that the UK, we believe in sharing the relevant information with the relevant countries. And to avoid another question, preempt another question, even after Brexit, whatever Brexit turns out to be, and I've no idea what it will be, even after Brexit, we will go on sharing and being part of a European security community. There's a very important group called the Counterterrorism Group, which works for the Bern Group, and that's the heads of the security services of all the EU members and Norway and Switzerland. So that's a body that can continue to work even after Brexit. And I think what's needed, and it's in this report now, is to stretch out to the United States and find really effective ways of connecting with our Canadian and American friends.
I do want to say in fairness, because I think Anne-Marie was correct, even in the US or in Britain where we spend quite a bit on this, sometimes you lose track of people. I mean, you know, there's always a limitation to resources and your ability to follow everybody is always constrained. But I do think the technology does give you a little bit of an advantage now. And without getting too detailed or getting to things maybe that I don't want to say publicly, I think there are ways using technology, once you have identified somebody as appropriate to be monitoring. Let's say they are a foreign fighter who's come back, but you're not yet at the stage where you actually have a basis to arrest them. I think with appropriate legal authority, there are things you can do to keep track of their behavior both in the physical world and the online world, which will really leverage resources in terms of being able to monitor threats that are out there.
And that comes to this question that we've been asked through the app. So in this world, is there still, what's the role of human intelligence? Is it still important given where technology is?
The answer to that is yes.
Yes.
I'm in no doubt whatever that the human agent will remain extremely important. One of the byproducts of the Snowden revelations has been the way in which hard encryption has spread. Now, if you really want to get at the communications of a known suspect, one of the ways of doing that is, of course, having people who are close to that suspect who are prepared to provide information. So I think even in counterterrorism, the human part of this will remain extremely important.
Yes,
But
I'll go. Sir.
I think human remains very important in terrorism. And we see, I have mentioned the importance of communication, but we see that the terrorist organizations are more and more sophisticated to avoid interception and to use encryption. On the other side, to run human sources inside terrorist organizations is a very dangerous exercise. And you have to be very cautious. It's possible, but you need time, you need a lot of efforts. But again, I think in the future it will be very important to gain the right sources inside these terrorist organizations, and that's possible.
I think there's an important, just very quickly to say on the question of what happens next, one of the questions which came up, AQ is an organization, Daesh is an organization. That's not, it's the movement that they represent, and it will morph so that we will be facing exactly the same problems in a slightly different form for several years to come. So the sort of investment that Hanning's just mentioned has to go on, because this isn't going to end when, as I hope, Mosul is finally liberated.
But let me say this also. I mean, people think about human intelligence as we're going to put James Bond undercover into a terrorist cell, and that kind of thing may happen from time to time. But there's another dimension to human intelligence. One of the things we've seen in the U.S. is that some of the people who are inspired, not necessarily directed, but inspired to carry out terrorist attacks, are people who are either petty criminals or are in some ways mentally disturbed or troubled. And they're attracted by this image of violence. And often people in the community, family members, co-workers, are the first ones to see something is going off the rails. And that's also a form of human intelligence. We need to be able to engage in the community to get an early warning about people who might be potentially posing a threat. In many ways, this means getting, as I said earlier, closer cooperation between the local police and local, prominent people in the community. And we also need to find a way sometimes to intervene with troubled individuals before they get to the point of actually becoming operational. And some of that may involve also some psychological or sociological intervention. So we need to look at all the tools that are available, not just for the hardened, well-trained operative, but for the person who's maybe right on the edge, and we want to make sure they don't tip over and become an instrument of terror.
Annemie, I'm going to invite some questions from the audience, but just you wanted to speak, but just
Well,
very briefly.
Just very briefly, you must go and very local, and then the human impact is so important, because we had in Europe that project, the COPRA project, just to look how people can radicalize and that you can see symbols and symptoms and that you can maybe bring them back to the right side of the society. And on the other hand, you must go very international by sharing information. But you need both sides, and the local police is so important to see that maybe there are some areas where people are radicalization via internet, but you see it also. And we saw it with the shoe bomber who was living in Belgium and tried to do an attack in Copenhagen. It was someone that after that, his neighborhood said, we saw it, but we didn't know what to do with it. So you must go and very local and very international. And on the local level, then you need the policemen, and then you need really the teachers, the schools, everyone to to see if someone is changing in an abnormal way.
Thank you. There are teams of people with microphones, and I already see a gentleman in the middle with a question.
Okay, so my name is Julian Fotan. I come from Romania. First of all, I welcome the report. We need this debate. And I have two questions. One is regarding the need for a transatlantic grand strategy. And I will explain why I underline this idea. You know, I worked 6 years for the president of Romania, so I'm familiar also with the discussions in the European Council. My feeling is that on the one hand, we do our best to cooperate as much as we do for the moment at the level of intelligence agencies. On the other hand, we take bad strategic decisions, you know, at the high level, as it was the case of Libya and also Syria. So I think that first of all, we need to put closer the experts and the decision makers, because honestly, we will waste money. Yes. So is it possible to bring closer the experts and the decision makers, not to take another strategic errors when it comes to Middle East? Secondly, how do we keep closer to us countries like Israel, Jordan, Turkey? Turkey said recently they will go forward with the death penalty. Okay, so we will lose Turkey in this fight against terrorism, because I think it's very important to keep Turkey as an ally. They are in NATO. So the second question is, how do we keep close countries like Israel? They have a huge expertise, but on the other hand, the attitude in Europe on Israel is a very ambivalent one. So what shall we do? Thank you.
Thank you. That's going to be the longest question we have in this session, I hope. The gentleman on the front.
Yes. It's strange that even these questions we discuss today follow fashions. The whole time we heard only about terrorists and the dangers which comes from Near East and from this side. Nevertheless, in our part of the world, we see the things a bit different, because with all due respect to Daesh and ISIS, they can't compete with the average traffic weekend in Europe and the amount of deaths. But we hardly discuss the fact that in the meantime, Russian secret services were, especially in our area, much more efficient. Whereas in my younger days, it was mainly in the left. Now, it is the most influential people are on the conservative side, in the industrialists, and so on. And we hardly discuss these questions, which have paramount danger for us in this part of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I guess the question of risk assessment. Yeah. There is another question that.
Well, why don't we just maybe we should just answer. Let me just take a crack at the two questions. So first, I want to say with respect to the issue of transatlantic cooperation, you know, my experience when I was in office, which was admittedly some time back, it was about 8 years ago, was we had very good cooperation on a transatlantic basis with respect to our dealing with terrorism. I recognize that sometimes on particular issues there'll be disagreements. But, for example, there was disagreement about going into Iraq. But that never affected the ability to work together jointly on terrorism issues among all countries. And I do think that continuing to be engaged is important. I also would say that that includes, as you point out, countries like Israel and Jordan. Saudi Arabia has been a very good partner with the U.S. on sharing intelligence with respect to violent jihadism. And even Turkey, although we have some challenges now in that relationship, there are certain areas where I do think we can work together. You know, and sometimes you have to navigate an ambiguous situation where there may be a disagreement in one area, but a common interest in another area, and you need to work in the area of common interest. Finally, let me say on the issue of Russia, you know, we could spend, I would happily spend the next panel on Russia, Russian information operations, Russian aggressiveness in the Middle East, in the Baltics. You know, we live in a period of time where, unfortunately, you don't have the ability to only deal with one problem at a time. People now in the security field are going to be dealing with half a dozen problems: Middle East, Russia, China, domestic terrorism. All of these, you know, you may not be interested in all of them, but they're all interested in you, to paraphrase Trotsky.
Just before I bring David in, there is another question on an app which also pertains to Russia. Is Russia a potential source of risk through its support of far-right groups? The question asked. Anyway, David.
I just wanted to add a further complication to our discussion, which is that there's another threat out there which is growing very rapidly, and that's the threat in cyberspace. Threat to our companies, threat to our governments, threat to individuals. And terrorism is not the only threat, it's the one we're discussing on this panel, but I just want to register that if we get to a stage where these two threats coincide, and where those who mean us harm start to acquire and use serious cyber weapons, then we will have a really, really difficult time. I hope that's not going to happen, but if I had to predict, I would say it's going to get worse.
One small remark. Yes, we have to cooperate with countries like Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. I think there is a quite good cooperation. I can tell it from the German side with Mossad and others. Yes, very important. Russia is a problem under different aspects. You see, in Syria, people from Chechnya are fighting for ISIS. They are the most sophisticated foreign fighters there. We have in Germany now more and more asylum seekers coming from Chechnya to Germany, and there was a very huge police operation against possible terrorists from Chechnya, from the original Chechnya. Therefore, yes, on the one side, we have to cooperate to a certain extent with Russia. On the other side, we have conflicting interests. Interest is a very difficult issue. And terrorism, I think that is a very important point. Yes, you can ask and challenge, is it really so dangerous? If we are looking to the victims, we have mentioned the victims in traffic jams and so on. But on the other side, terrorism is poisoning our relationship to the whole Muslim community. Therefore, is terrorism a very difficult political problem. It's not only a problem for security, it's a very difficult political problem. And therefore, we have really to deal with this kind of terrorism because people feel insecure, they feel threatened by all these immigrants, and therefore, again, fighting against terrorism is a very important contribution to our internal situation in the European countries. And we have our Muslim communities, and therefore it's very important to fight effectively terrorism.
Let me do you want to find that?
Well, you have the three issues at this moment. You have the illegal migration, you have the terrorism, and the cyber criminality. And they are affecting each other, not completely, but there are links. And that makes it, I fully agree with you, that when you talked about terrorism and cyber criminality, add on that the migration issue, and then you have really a very dangerous cocktail. And we can, of course, talk, and that's also terrible, all the people who die in the weak traffic in the streets. But here you have really threats for countries and that are affecting the relationship with the Muslim community. But it's really, the three together is very difficult to deal with it. And when we are looking in Europe, the illegal migration is another issue in the border countries, in the Central European countries, and the terrorism issue is more in the Western European countries. And that's the reason also that working together and sharing information in Europe is also so difficult, because we want to do it between the 28 countries. And in fact, we don't need to do it between the 28 countries. For my country, it's so important that we can work together with the Netherlands, with France, with Germany, with the UK, and with the United States, and less with other countries at this moment. We must, of course, be very, very careful. And then on the illegal migration and protecting the borders, it's much more an issue of the Central European countries. And I think that that's something, I fully agree with you when I say that you must change the Treaty of Lisbon. That's like the long term, but you must also, on a summit like this, we also must have dreams and can have dreams. I hope so. But on the short term, I think that we need a much more flexible Europe and share information, not all the time between 28 countries, but from time to time with clusters of 8 countries, 6 countries, 5 countries, 4 countries, and then we will move much more forward than we are doing today.
Yeah, I think that actually is really an excellent point that underscores what we tried to do in our report. which was to say exactly that. You don't
You
need
can
to
add
have,
it, eh?
right, you don't need to have 27 or 30 countries all sharing everything at the same time. You can, exactly, you can build clusters. There are some countries where both the capability and the need are great for almost constant sharing. Others, it can be much more, based on an individual case. And that's a good example of being practical, not trying to construct some grand, perfect strategy, but doing something that can be done in the short term for those countries that have the greatest concern and the greatest to contribute.
So there's a question that's probably has partly been answered anyway from Nicole Koenig. Should the EU Intelligence Centre be strengthened, and if so, how?
May I?
Can I just...
Stumped.
I
Sorry,
was just going to say, I'm sure strengthening it
Yeah.
is a good thing. It's already been strengthened. Two practical things nations can do: make sure that they are sending the very best of their analysts to the centre, and secondly, sharing their strategic analysis. The situation, the intelligence centre is not dealing with the tactical chase after terrorists, but it is providing, coming back to an earlier question, it is providing that strategic view, pulling together information from the nations that will underpin council decisions about Europe's foreign policy. So it's really important that they have the best ability to do that.
For our issue, let me add,
Yes.
is the cooperation between the domestic European services. The Berner Club has been mentioned, I think, the most important issue. They have built a new center in the Netherlands, and from my perspective, that's working very well. And there is the platform for the exchange of information. Brussels is more a strategic exercise, like David has mentioned.
Thank you. Audience, oh, yes, good. Very brief questions, please. I can see a hand over there, 2 hands here. So we'll take those 3 questions. Do keep them brief, though.
John Roberts, NG Analyst. Can I ask, how do you reach out to sometimes fairly tight-knit communities, notably amongst the Muslim immigrants in Europe, but not solely confined to them, and get them to report unusual cases of behavior without, as it were, creating some kind of big brother state or frightening people so that they just simply are afraid to inform? What kind of outreach program do you have that can bridge the gap between, as it were, the regular gathering of intelligence and a fear that people would have that you are indeed probing into their lives and affecting their privacy?
Thank you. I saw a couple of hand here. Yes, please.
Thank you. Riva Castoriano from Sciences Po Paris. And listening to you, I just missing a word, that is the network. You mentioned we have to deal with migrants in Netherlands, Belgium, France, etc. And having followed all the networks of the jihadists of Madrid, London, and France, Bataclan, and Brussels, I think we have a lot of clues on all the ways that these jihadists are going through, the places they are going through, the borders they are crossing. And so how come the intelligence cannot work with these networks and work also with the home countries besides Turkey? But you have also Morocco, you have also Algeria, and how these countries can help to follow the networks of these people. And what I see here, just the last sentence, is I see confrontation of 2 understanding of globalization. If I may say so, they are in advance on globalization of using space, borders, and transnational action and transnational movement, as you mentioned. And states are much more confined on their legislation, on their territorial understanding, and we will see in the next session how they care much more about their local elections and rise of populism rather than trying to follow their networks through globalization.
Thank you. Yes, migration is the next session. A gentleman in the middle.
Martin Michlo from the Europom Institute for European Policy in Prague. I had a question about the links between the traditional organized crime networks and the terrorist networks. It's been proven that, for example, the attacks that were carried out on November 13th, the means that were used partly came from the traditional organized crime networks. So I wanted to see whether in your thinking, you were able to link these two issues? And a second very short question is there any thought about a common European legal framework to punish or to deter counterterrorism?
Thank you. So, communities, networks, organized crime.
Let me deal with the first question, which I think is a question that people in the US, I'm sure in Europe, are thinking about quite a lot. And I would say that when I was in office, and I think my successors have done this too, we tried to do quite a bit of outreach to the various communities, particularly the Muslim community. And we found that there was a great receptivity when they did see somebody who was perhaps looking to travel overseas to get involved with a terrorist group fighting. There was a willingness to sometimes raise a hand and say there's a problem here. But in order to make that possible, we had to do two things. One, we had to create kind of a safe space to have that conversation. And that means sometimes that you need to have a response that's not just a law enforcement response, lock somebody up, but that you need to be able to bring community leaders in, even social, therapy people, to come in and try to move someone who's in the process of radicalization off that process. The second thing, which is really important, is if you want to have that cooperation with the community, you cannot demonize an entire religion or ethnic group. People who do that are literally playing right into the hands of the worst terrorists. And so we made it very clear, and I know President Bush did this literally while the smoke was rising from the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. He said, we're not at war with Islam. We're not. The vast majority of Muslims in the US are loyal Americans. There's an ideology that we have to deal with, but that's not to be confused with an entire people. And I think that keeping that in mind is critical. And nowadays, unfortunately, you can find some voices that want to sweep a whole nationality or a whole religion into a category, and that is so counterproductive that we need to push very hard against that.
David?
Some quick thoughts on those questions. First, we've already heard about locality, the local effort, and I think that is really the heart of the answer to the first question. The way to get communities involved is to have them working together on projects, improving the neighborhood, raising funds for new sports facilities. If the different communities that will be present in any one space are working together, then you will really begin to see a sense of comfort at being part of, in my case, British society. Networks is a hugely important word. It's in the report again and again. It's about flexibility and having that flexibility, because this threat is going to change and adapt, and we need to be able to flex our responses accordingly. Organized crime, petty criminality, certainly there's a lot of contact, and we've heard that. Most of the major organized crime is not yet, I think, connected. I haven't seen much evidence that is connected to the Salafi jihadist movements. But on the dark web, on the dark net, it is possible to acquire hacking tools. It's possible to acquire weapons anonymously. There are some serious policing issues around getting that information and dealing with those. And finally, on the common legal framework, we have the European arrest warrant. I think that was a huge step forward. I think I'm a very strong supporter of that, and we've used it in the UK to get back one of the attempted bombers in 2005, but from Italy, using that arrest warrant. A common legal framework is much harder. You have different legal traditions. You have common law traditions. You have, as it were, the legacy of Napoleonic law. It's all very difficult. I wouldn't say go down that route.
No, but that's in fact a discussion also on the Treaty of Lisbon.
Yeah.
It's so difficult for member states in Europe to give a small part of the security competences to a higher level. So it stays something, I fully agree with you, but in fact, it's quite normal that you talk about it and that you think about it. And I know that the legislation is so different in European countries. But on the other hand, when we really want to deal with it, then we must have the guts to talk about that. But I would like to talk about the local communities. A word that we didn't have used today is the word prevention. We are always talking, and it's normal. With this panel, I was not only Minister of Justice, but also Home Affairs and Migration. So then we are talking about the tough side and when something is happening. But you must also talk about prevention. Because what shocked me the most in Belgium after the attacks, that was one of the killers was hidden in his own community for weeks. And that's not normal. That's really not normal. You can't talk and you can't talk about the Muslim community, but on the other hand, it's not normal that 5 kilometers from the place where the attack was, 5 kilometers of that place, the killer was hidden for weeks. Then we have a problem, really have a problem.
One small remark to your question, changing responsibilities to Brussels. I'm coming from London, and I've heard yesterday there are some issues which are so important that you can't give them to Brussels.
I know, that's the point.
But some other issues. Yes, Muslim communities, it's very important. We have in Germany the so-called Islam Conference. We have always this kind of problems and discussions with our representatives of the Muslim communities. On the one side, they are telling us Muslim religion has nothing to do with terrorism. On the other side, we see these terrorist attacks are in the name of Islam and think that's creating some problems. Therefore, yes, we have to deal with, and I see a special responsibility for the Muslim community in these issues, and we try to communicate with them, we try to integrate them in the German society. Whether we like it or not, they are part of the German society, and we have to deal with. The question, organized crime, yes, there are some links between organized crime and jihadi terrorism. We have seen it for the first time in Madrid. David, you remember?
Yeah.
There have been links. We have seen it now in Brussels to a certain extent. We have to be very, very cautious. Yes, there are links, and we have to follow these links, and that is part of the, new procedures of terrorism in Europe and Germany.
Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left. Even though it's first thing on a Sunday morning, you've been active on social media. So on the screen there are a few comments. The one nice one is an excellent panel on intelligence, it said. But after Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the same problem in slightly different form for the next several years. Questions, very brief, because we have 10 minutes. There is one in the gloom. I can see a hand going up, I think.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Jakub Rafaj, Maastricht University, Czech Republic. As much as I agree with improvement of cooperation in Europe, as you could see, many terrorists made their way by abusing the immigration crisis and traveling through Balkans. Isn't the Balkans the place where we should aim our efforts to improve the cooperation with the security? Because I feel that this is the place where they practically disappear on their way to Europe. Thank you.
Anybody want to take that? Any more questions? There's the, on the front, the lady here.
Just following what Annemie said about regional and international level. I am from Poland, Center for International Relations. Regional level, local level. We've just had a NATO summit in Warsaw. It was very successful, but it was also a lot of thinking how to protect everything before. And there were many training sessions done for the local communities and for local, for the city hall, basically. And this turned out to be an interesting experience because we just realized that they know nothing about even seeing just simple signals that there must be something wrong going on. So I think this could be a very good idea if we can just at the local level, through the local governments, just do a lot of training, both to the local government officials and to the people. And second, international...
Sorry, we've got very little time.
Yeah, international level is, question is how to deal with the situation in Europe where we have countries like Eastern Central Europe with the tradition that this was difficult for us as societies to share something with police or the government, because we were in a situation of the opposite, right? That this was exactly what we should not do.
Thank you.
But I have a nice suggestion. In 2010, we started in Europe with the COPRA project, and that was really educate and give training to local policemen to see what are the physical changes in someone that you must be careful and that maybe he's thinking of bad influences. So that exists. I know that in 2010, Belgium was president of that moment of Europe, and we had a lot of critics because it was like you are, it was a little bit attacking too much people. But on the other hand, today we can see that it's really a very helpful instrument for local policemen, because I've already said it, you must go very low, very local, and very international in sharing information. And then we can deal a lot, and then we can do a lot.
Thank you. I'll just take another question here and then invite the panel to...
Franz Nauschig, Austrian Central Bank. You said foreign fighters pose a big threat. Would it be a way to strip them of a citizenship and deny them access to Europe?
Thank you. Very brief, very nice. And I just have a final question to put into the mix, because it seems to me there's a distinction between kind of information and intelligence, and information is perhaps something that one can share on a sort of multinational basis, and intelligence is something that probably will, because of what you said, partly, but will always be shared on a bilateral basis. But I just have the question about sources and methods, because one hears one must protect sources and methods. But I sometimes wonder why intelligence, or the fruits of the fruits of the kind of sources and methods, can't be shared without necessarily exposing. So could more actually be shared bilaterally by intelligence agencies than actually are at the moment? And there's really too much caution, at the moment among intelligence agencies. So, but I'd like you to ask that and the other questions that we've had from the audience.
Well, expect there to be a continuing instinct for caution on the part of intelligence agencies, because that's how they think. But there's been a dramatic change over the last few years. Subjects such as hacking or equipment interference or mining bulk databases, subjects which would never have been discussed by governments in public, are now open. Various countries are legislating, including my own, to control and oversee such activity. So I think it will get easier, but the deep secrets of who exactly is providing information, those must be protected. Can I just make a point about global, because this has been a very Eurocentric discussion, and it could sound as if we believe this threat is only in Europe. Think of all those British tourists murdered on the beach at Sousse. Think about the Norwegian oil workers who were captured in Amanas attack. Think about Pakistan, Mali, North Africa, Pakistan, Southeast Asia. This is actually a global phenomenon, and I think Europe needs to lift its eyes beyond Europe when it's making its policy in the European Council and support countries like the United States that have that global outlook.
Thank you. Michael?
I'll just very briefly, I'll just touch on the point about local training. And I was at a conference up in Stockholm a few weeks ago where they talked about securing the city. I think there's no question that particularly as we deal with these plots involving small groups, or where the plot is being enabled by connections with criminal gangs or things of that sort, that training local officials about what to look for is very important and yields a lot of results. If you look at New York City, New York City does a tremendous job of focusing within its own borders as well as overseas on where the threats may be. So that's an area which I think in all of our countries would be useful to focus on.
Enemy, and there was the question about citizenship too. I mean, if you'd like to answer that as we
Yes,
wrap
but
up.
I fully agree with the fact that we mustn't talk only about Europe, but the transnational. I think this report is for that reason very, very important. But on the other hand, it's also easier when you have a flexible Europe to work easier together with the United States or with Israel, who's having an excellent intelligence service. And that's a little bit what I want to see here. I know that we are not there in Europe, but we must really think about of a very much flexible Europe. Then we can much easier work together with other countries abroad, because the one thing that we are convinced, it's not only a problem of Europe, but it's a problem. But so we have, I think, also some content for the future TATRA summits to talk about that, because we are not there. We are not there, by the way, in which we, intra-Europe, want to organize everything. And we must have an answer on that, because otherwise the discussion to work together with the US will immediately become a discussion on how can we protect the privacy of our own citizens. And that's a catamacho, that's not a good discussion. Focus, share information for the potential criminals, and then you can give a full privacy protection to all the other citizens.
Thank you. August, last
I
word?
think, yes, we have a problem. In Europe, we have open borders. It's very easy to go from one country to another country. The whole intelligence landscape is national. We see some weaknesses, we see some problems. I think in the end of the day, we have to spend more resources for better law enforcement, better intelligence. We have to cooperate in a better way than before. Yes, we have to do this step by step. We have made recommendations in this proposal, which Michael has mentioned already. I think, yes, we should go ahead. No new bureaucracies, I don't think it would be helpful. One word to citizenship. Citizenship is a crucial issue in Germany because according to our constitution, it's not possible to withdraw citizenships in Germany. And we have a special weakness. We don't have a central register about our German passport holders, for example. And we have a lot of problems there. And we are in the phases lessons learned, all of us, and therefore I'm optimistic in the future. Yes, we can go ahead step by step, and I'm optimistic that we go further and that we reach progress.
David, 20 seconds, then you know more.
You can remove someone's passport, at least temporarily, as a restriction on travel if you've got the right kind of legislation in place. But you can't render someone stateless under international law. So you can't just say, you're out. Yeah. You have lost your citizenship. But you can control their...
At least in Europe, David.
Yeah.
Other countries is different.
I think we have to close it there, Michael, unless you actually want a very last word.
Well, I just, this report and the discussion here is really the beginning of a process, not the end of a process. But I hope it's one that we will refine and also be able to take a deeper look at some of the issues that have been raised here, whether it's the radicalization process, use of technology to leverage in terms of being able to monitor, and similar kinds of concepts.
Thank you. The fact you're all still here and all awake, I think is testimony to the excellence of this Sunday morning panel. So thank you very much to them. Thank you to you all for your participation, which has been wonderful. Refreshments outside in the lobby, but we're back in your seats, please, 10:45 for the next session on migration. Well, thank you all. Thank you, the panelists.